There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a dinner table right after someone you love has been insulted, and everyone at that table decides to pretend they didn't hear it. I know that silence well. I lived inside it for 11 years. I learned to recognize its exact weight, the way it settles differently depending on who delivered the insult and who was expected to absorb it without complaint. And for 11 years, the person expected to absorb it was my husband. My name is Mira. I am 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was known in my family as the daughter who married beneath herself. That is what my parents called it, though never quite in those words. They had other ways of saying it. Practical. Realistic. Grounded. Every time they used one of those words to describe my husband, Arjun, I felt something in my chest tighten just a little more, the way a rope tightens each time you pull it, imperceptibly at first, until one day you realize it has been cutting into you for years. I want to tell you this story from the very beginning, because I think you need to understand who I was before you understand who I became. I grew up in a house where success was measured entirely in visible things, degrees framed on walls, cars parked in the driveway for neighbors to notice, vacations photographed and shown to relatives who hadn't been invited, as though the photographs themselves were the point rather than the memories inside them. My father built a mid-sized construction business from nearly nothing, starting as a site supervisor and working his way, through sheer stubbornness and long hours, into ownership of his own company. My mother never let anyone forget how far they had come. Every conversation in our house eventually circled back, in one way or another, to how much they had achieved and how much further we, as their children, were expected to go. I was the only child for the first 9 years of my life before my younger brother, Rohan, was born, and in some ways that meant I absorbed the full weight of my parents' expectations before I had any language to push back against them. I remember being 6 years old and being asked, at a family gathering, what I wanted to be when I grew up, and answering, without hesitation, an artist. I remember the way the adults around the table laughed, not unkindly, but the particular laugh reserved for children who haven't yet learned what's expected of them. My father ruffled my hair and said, "She'll grow out of it." I did not grow out of it. I simply learned to keep it hidden. By the time I reached university, I had a folder of drawings I kept in the bottom of my cupboard, beneath winter blankets that were never used in our warm climate, purely because it was the one place I knew my mother would never look. I studied commerce, as my parents wished, and I was good at it, good enough that no one ever suspected how little of myself I had actually put into any of it. I was not unhappy, exactly. I want to be honest about that. I had a comfortable life, a family that provided for me materially in every way, and I told myself, the way many children of demanding parents tell themselves, that comfort and love were the same thing, and that if I simply performed well enough, the love would eventually feel unconditional. I met Arjun in my last year of university, in the strangest and least romantic way possible. My laptop had crashed 3 days before a major project submission, and a friend recommended a small computer repair shop above a tailor's on the edge of the university district, run by a young man who, she said, could fix anything for half of what the official service centers charged. I walked in expecting a transaction. I walked out, an hour later, having had the first real conversation about anything that mattered to me in longer than I could remember. Arjun was not what anyone would call impressive on paper. He worked part-time fixing computers while finishing a degree in mechanical engineering, and he lived in a rented room above that same tailor's shop, with a leaking tap he'd fixed himself and a window that never quite closed properly no matter how many times he adjusted the frame. He did not come from money. His father had been a schoolteacher in a small town, and his mother ran a modest tailoring business of her own before she passed away when Arjun was 19, a loss he spoke about carefully, the way people speak about wounds that have scarred over but never fully disappeared. But I want you to understand something about that first conversation, and the many that followed it. When Arjun looked at me, he didn't see the daughter of a successful man. He saw me. Just me. He asked about the drawings I mentioned almost by accident, the ones I'd trained myself never to bring up, and when I described them hesitantly, expecting the polite dismissal I'd learned to anticipate from everyone else, he asked if he could see them sometime. Not out of politeness. He actually wanted to see them. He remembered small things about me from that very first conversation, that I hated the taste of coriander, that I was afraid of elevators after getting stuck in one as a child, that I had once cried during a documentary about elephants and never told anyone the real reason why, which was that watching a mother elephant search for her lost calf had reminded me, in some buried way, of how alone I sometimes felt in a house full of people. He paid attention in a way that felt, to a girl who had grown up being seen only for what she represented rather than who she was, like being handed water after years of quiet thirst she hadn't even realized she was suffering from. We dated for a year and a half before I worked up the courage to bring him home. I want to be honest, I delayed it far longer than I needed to, not because I doubted my feelings for him, but because some instinctive part of me already knew how the introduction would go, and I wanted to protect the relationship, and myself, from that knowledge for as long as possible. When I finally brought him home, my mother served tea in the good cups, the ones reserved for guests who mattered, the ones with the thin gold rim that came out only for my father's business associates or relatives visiting from abroad, and then, halfway through the visit, under the pretense of clearing the table, quietly switched them out for the ordinary ones. I noticed. Arjun noticed too, though he never said anything, not that evening and not for years afterward, until one night much later in our marriage when he mentioned it so casually I realized he had been carrying the memory of that small humiliation the entire time, simply choosing not to burden me with it. That was the first cut. It would not be the last. He seems like a nice boy, my father said after Arjun left that evening, in the particular tone people use when they mean precisely the opposite of what they're saying. But Mira, a nice boy is not always the right boy. What does that mean? I asked, though I already understood exactly what it meant. It means, my mother said, not looking up from the newspaper she was pretending to read, that you have options. Real options. Boys with names, with futures, with families that can stand beside ours at a wedding without anyone whispering. Why settle? Settle. That single word would follow me for the next 11 years, spoken aloud at some moments and left unspoken, hanging in the air, at countless others. It was there in the particular way my mother sighed whenever Arjun's name came up in conversation. It was there in the way she introduced him to relatives. This is Mira's husband, Arjun, he has his own little computer business, the word little doing more damage in that sentence than any direct insult could have managed. I married him anyway. I want to be honest with you about how that happened, because it wasn't the easy, dramatic defiance you see in films, where the daughter stands up at the dinner table and declares her independence in one triumphant speech. It was quieter than that, and far messier. It was months of late-night phone calls where I cried more than I spoke. It was afternoons spent sitting in my car outside my parents' house, unable to go in, unable to explain to Arjun why I couldn't simply tell them to accept my choice. It was the constant, exhausting calculation of trying to figure out how to have both things I wanted, my parents' approval and the man I loved, when it slowly became clear that I could not have both, that I would eventually have to choose. I remember one particular night, about 4 months before our wedding, when I sat on the edge of Arjun's narrow bed in that room above the tailor's shop, sobbing in the way you only sob when you're exhausted from carrying something for far too long. Maybe this is a mistake, I said, not meaning it, but needing to say it out loud to see how it felt. Maybe I should just do what they want. It would be easier. Arjun didn't argue with me. He didn't defend himself or list his own merits, which I think, looking back, is exactly why what he said next affected me so deeply. He simply sat beside me, took my hand, and said, "You don't have to choose me, Mira. If staying with your family, keeping that peace, matters more to you than this, I'll understand. I won't pretend it won't break something in me, but I'll understand. But please, whatever you decide, don't choose against yourself. Don't spend the rest of your life wondering what you gave up to keep people happy who were never going to be fully happy with you anyway." That sentence stayed with me for the rest of my life. Don't choose against yourself. I chose him. And it would take me years, many, many years, to fully understand that choosing him and choosing myself had, all along, been the exact same choice. The wedding, when it finally happened, was small. Smaller, certainly, than anything my parents had ever hosted or attended for anyone else in the family. My parents were present, technically, fulfilling the minimum expected of them, but I remember my father's face throughout the ceremony, not angry exactly, but distant, wearing the particular expression of a man attending an event he had already, privately, decided didn't matter as much as it should have. My mother cried during the rituals, but I don't believe, even now, that those were entirely happy tears. Arjun's family, by contrast, was warm and loud and unreservedly delighted, his father, especially, beaming with a pride so unguarded it almost embarrassed me, accustomed as I was to affection measured out carefully, conditionally. The contrast between the two sides of that small hall told its own story. One, I was too young, too hopeful, and frankly too exhausted from the months of conflict leading up to it, to fully read at the time. The mockery started small. It always does. It starts small enough that you can convince yourself you're imagining it, that you're simply too sensitive, that families tease one another and this is entirely normal, the ordinary texture of belonging to a large, opinionated family. I told myself this so many times over the following years that I nearly believed it, right up until the moment I could no longer avoid seeing the pattern clearly for what it was. At the first Diwali dinner after our wedding, my father asked Arjun, in front of the extended family, what he was currently earning. When Arjun answered honestly, a modest figure, accurate to that early stage of his small repair business, my father laughed. Not cruelly, not loudly. Just a short exhale through his nose, followed by, well, at least you're consistent. Everyone at the table smiled, the particular smile people wear when they've heard something unkind and have collectively decided not to acknowledge it. I felt my face grow hot. I looked at Arjun, expecting to see hurt, and instead saw only careful neutrality, a mask I would come to recognize over the following years as something he had trained himself to wear, a skill honed through repeated practice rather than natural composure. My cousin Divya got engaged around that same time, to a man who worked in finance for a large multinational firm, and the wedding my parents threw for her, because Divya was, by that point, practically treated as a second daughter in our extended family, was enormous. 3 different catering teams. A photography crew flown in specifically from another city. An entire second function just for the mehendi ceremony, with professional lighting designed for the photographs. At my own wedding reception, held 8 months earlier, my mother had insisted, in front of the event planner, on what she called the family package, half the size of Divya's, half the flowers, a single photographer working alone. I told myself it didn't matter. Weddings are one day, I reminded myself over and over, and marriages are the rest of your life. I repeated this to myself so often, in so many quiet moments, that I nearly convinced myself it erased the sting. It did not erase the sting. It simply taught me how to carry it without visibly flinching. But the comments continued, steady as a slow drip that eventually, given enough time, can wear a groove into stone. Every visit, every festival, every ordinary Sunday lunch at my parents' house became another small occasion for a precise, almost surgical wound. Arjun, still fixing computers, my father would ask, as though 4 full years hadn't passed, as though Arjun hadn't, by then, started his own small IT repair and networking business, hiring first 1 employee, then 2, slowly building something that required real skill in management and vision, not merely technical repair work. When will you get a real job? My mother asked once, at a cousin's birthday party, loudly enough that several relatives turned to listen. I watched Arjun's jaw tighten and then deliberately relax, the way a man practices controlling his own face when he's had years of forced practice doing exactly that. He never fought back. That was the thing about my husband that both broke my heart and made me love him more fiercely with every passing year. He absorbed those comments the way a man might stand in steady rain without an umbrella, not because he didn't feel the water soaking through his clothes, but because he had decided, somewhere early on, that reacting visibly would only hand them more material to laugh about, more evidence for the story they had already decided to tell about him. "Your parents raised you," he told me once, late at night, after a particularly sharp comment from my father about how some men just aren't built for real ambition. "I'm not going to make you choose between defending me and respecting the people who raised you. I'll survive their words, Mira. I've survived worse. What I couldn't survive is losing you to guilt over a fight that isn't really yours to fight." I did try to defend him in my own small, imperfect ways. I'd change the subject abruptly, sometimes clumsily. I'd find an excuse to leave the room when a comment landed particularly hard. Once, after my mother remarked that Divya's husband had provided her a beautiful house in the very first year of marriage while Arjun and I were still renting a small 2-room flat above a pharmacy, I snapped, more sharply than I intended, "We're building something, Ma. It doesn't happen in a single year." My mother looked at me with an expression that landed somewhere between amusement and pity. "Building," she repeated, drawing the word out slightly, as though testing its shape in her mouth, finding it wanting. "That's what you call it." What none of them knew, what I myself barely allowed myself to fully believe, even as I watched it happening, was that Arjun's small repair shop had, by the time we reached our 5th year of marriage, quietly transformed into something else entirely. It began with a single corporate client who needed their office network overhauled after a security breach that had cost them significant money and reputation. Arjun did the work meticulously, staying up 3 consecutive nights to make sure the new system was airtight, and that client referred him to another, and then another. He started taking on cybersecurity consulting work for small and mid-sized businesses that couldn't afford the enormous fees charged by the established firms but still needed real protection. Then, almost by accident, he built something larger. A retail client had asked for a custom scheduling and inventory management system, something specific to their small chain of stores, and rather than pay ongoing licensing fees to an existing software platform that didn't quite fit their needs, Arjun offered to build it himself. It took him 4 months of nights and weekends, on top of his existing client work, but when he finished, the system worked better than anything commercially available at that price point. Word spread. Other small retailers wanted the same thing. What had started as a single custom project slowly became a product, one he refined, rebuilt, and eventually began selling as a subscription service to small businesses across the region. I watched all of this happen from the inside, and it changed something in me too, in ways I didn't fully recognize until much later. I would sit beside him at our small kitchen table late into the night, helping him format invoices, listening to him talk through technical problems with a kind of hunger and clarity I had genuinely never witnessed in my own father, who by that point ran his construction company largely on the strength of decades-old relationships and inherited contracts, rather than any real ongoing vision or innovation. Arjun didn't merely want to earn money, though the money mattered, of course it mattered. He wanted to build something that would outlast him, something with genuine structural integrity, the way an engineer thinks about load-bearing walls rather than decoration. And slowly, so slowly that I almost didn't register it happening in real time around me, our life began to shift beneath our feet, quietly, invisibly, like tectonic plates moving beneath a landscape that still looked, from the surface, exactly the same as it always had. We never told my parents about any of this. That decision was Arjun's idea originally, and I resisted it at first. Wasn't it a kind of dishonesty, I asked him, hiding our success from my own family? But he said something during that conversation that stayed with me for years afterward. "If we tell them now," he said, "it becomes a competition. A scoreboard they get to keep score of, the way they've kept score of everything else in your family my whole time knowing them. I don't want your parents' respect because of a number sitting in a bank account somewhere. I want to build something real first, something solid, before anyone outside this house even knows it exists. Let the truth arrive on its own timeline, not theirs." So we kept living modestly in front of them, deliberately, carefully. We still drove the same aging car to family functions long after we could have afforded something newer. I still wore the same handful of good saris, rotating them with enough care that no one would notice a pattern or ask uncomfortable questions about new purchases. It felt, on certain difficult nights, like living something close to a double life, one identity where I remained the pitted daughter who had settled for less than she deserved, and another private identity, visible only within the walls of our small flat, where I watched my husband build an actual, substantial business from a laptop balanced on our second-hand kitchen table. But keeping that secret cost something too, some quiet toll that accumulated slowly over years. I remember one dinner in particular, my father's 60th birthday celebration, held at a rented hall with nearly 40 relatives in attendance, when my uncle, a loud, well-meaning but consistently tactless man, asked Arjun directly, in front of the entire gathering, "So when are you going to give Mira a proper house? A man should provide for his wife properly, no?" And my father, rather than deflecting the comment or moving the conversation along as any reasonably kind host might have done, actually laughed and said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear clearly, "Some men provide, Ramesh. Others just try their best." The surrounding tables laughed along with him, that easy, comfortable laughter of people who don't fully register that they're laughing at someone's quiet pain. I sat there holding a plate of food I could no longer taste, watching my husband's face carefully rearrange itself into something calm, something unbothered on the surface, something that cost him far more than any of those laughing relatives would ever understand or acknowledge. I caught his eye across the table for just a moment, and in that brief glance, I saw something I rarely let myself fully look at, not anger, but a deep, patient exhaustion, the particular tiredness of a man who has decided, again and again, night after night, year after year, that dignity sometimes means choosing silence over a fight you could win but shouldn't have to keep fighting in the first place. That night, in the car on the way home, I cried. Not loudly, I had learned, by then, how to cry without making any sound at all, a skill I am not proud of possessing but one that 11 years of small, accumulated humiliations had taught me with brutal efficiency. Arjun reached over without a word and took my hand off the gear shift, holding it steady in his own. "One day," he said quietly, eyes on the road ahead, "this won't matter to us anymore. Not because we proved anything to them, not because we won some argument we were never really trying to win. But because we'll have built a life so genuinely full that it simply won't have room left in it for their opinion of us." I believed him. I wanted, with everything in me, to believe him. But I didn't yet know how soon, or how completely, and in what strange, unexpected form, that day would eventually arrive. What I couldn't have known, sitting in that car with mascara tracking silently down my face, was that within a few short years, the very house my parents lived in, the house where a decade of quiet humiliation had been served alongside dinner, would need saving from collapse. And the only people capable of saving it would turn out to be the two of us. But that part of the story comes later, and I have to tell you first how everything nearly fell apart entirely before it ever came together, because betrayal, real betrayal, the kind that reshapes you permanently, doesn't always arrive from strangers or distant acquaintances. Sometimes it arrives from the very people who are supposed to love you most unconditionally, and it arrives disguised, cleverly, as concern, as tradition, as nothing more than just being honest with you, beta, because we love you and want better for you. And what happened next tested every quiet promise Arjun and I had made to each other across all those years, in ways neither of us ever saw coming, not even after everything that had already come before. The trouble began, as trouble within families so often does, with money, though notably not our money. My father's. I found out slowly, in scattered pieces, the way you tend to find out most things your parents actively don't want you to know. It started innocuously enough, with a phone call from my mother, her voice thinner and more careful than her usual tone, asking whether Arjun perhaps knew anyone reliable in banking who could help with a small matter that had come up. I remember feeling an uncomfortable, complicated flicker of something in that moment, not quite satisfaction exactly, but uncomfortably close to it, and immediately feeling ashamed of myself for feeling it at all. I asked what was wrong. She brushed the question aside quickly. "Nothing serious, Mira. Just some business matters. Your father will sort it out, as always." Your father did not, in fact, sort it out. Over the following months, the phone calls from my mother grew more frequent, and beneath her increasingly forced casualness, I could hear a tension steadily building, straining the edges of her voice in ways that were becoming harder for her to disguise. My father's construction company, it eventually emerged, had taken out a substantial loan roughly 2 years earlier to expand into an ambitious new commercial project, a mid-sized shopping complex being developed on the edge of town, a project he had been immensely, publicly proud of, the kind of undertaking he liked to reference casually at social gatherings as proof of his continued relevance in a construction industry that was, in reality, rapidly leaving men of his generation and his methods behind, unable or unwilling to adapt to newer approaches, newer technologies, newer expectations from clients and investors alike. The project had stalled badly. A key financial partner had unexpectedly withdrawn midway through construction. Costs had overrun significantly, as they so often do when a project loses its momentum and drags on far longer than originally budgeted. And the loan itself, secured partly against my parents' house, the very house I had grown up in, the same house where every family dinner for over a decade had come served with a quiet side dish of contempt for my husband, was now at genuine, serious risk of default. I learned the full shape of the situation almost by accident, actually, through Arjun rather than through my own parents. One of the banks my father had approached for an emergency bridge loan happened, coincidentally, to be a bank whose small business lending division Arjun's company already did contract cybersecurity auditing work for. A colleague of his mentioned, in passing, without any awareness of the family connection, a stalled commercial loan application filed under my father's company name, internally flagged as high risk within their systems. Arjun came home that particular evening noticeably quieter than usual, and when I gently pressed him about what was wrong, he sat me down and told me everything he'd learned. I remember sitting very still at our kitchen table, absorbing each detail as he laid it out carefully, watching my own hands on the table as though they belonged to someone else. They could actually lose the house, I said finally, the words feeling strange and heavy in my mouth. They're not there yet, Arjun said carefully, choosing his words with visible caution. But if they can't successfully restructure the existing debt, or bring in significant new capital within the next several months, then yes, Mira. It's a very real possibility. A serious one. I didn't quite know what to do with the tangle of feelings that rose up in me all at once. Some small, deeply wounded part of me, the part shaped by 11 years of settling and consistent and quiet dinner table laughter at Arjun's expense, felt something uncomfortably close to a bitter, satisfying vindication rising in my chest. Now you know, that part of me whispered, what it actually feels like to build something with your whole life and watch it not be enough, watch it threaten to slip away despite everything you've poured into it. I am not proud of that thought. I am sharing it with you now because I promised myself, in telling this story honestly, that I would include the parts of myself that weren't particularly kind or admirable, not only the parts that make me look good in hindsight. But underneath that flicker of ugly satisfaction sat something else entirely, something larger and considerably more painful, a genuine, aching fear for my parents, whatever their considerable flaws. They were still my parents, whatever else had passed between us. I had grown up within those walls. I had learned to read sitting in that very living room, celebrated countless birthdays in that overgrown back garden, hidden trembling beneath that same dining table during monsoon thunderstorms as a small child, convinced the sky itself was falling. The thought of that house being taken from them, of my father, proud, difficult, wounding, endlessly complicated my father, losing the singular achievement his entire adult identity had been quietly built around, made something deep in my chest ache in a way I hadn't fully anticipated feeling. I told Arjun, that same evening, that I wanted to help them. He was quiet for a long moment before responding, clearly weighing his words with unusual care. Mira, he said finally, I need you to think about this very, very carefully before we go any further. Your parents have spent 11 years telling everyone within earshot who would listen that I wasn't good enough for you. That I couldn't properly provide for you. That you settled for less than you deserved by marrying me. If we step in now, if we quietly save them from this, are you doing it because it's genuinely the right thing to do? Or is some part of you doing it because you want them to finally see what I've actually built, whether they ever acknowledge it out loud or not? It was a fair question, and it stung precisely because it was so unmistakably fair. I sat with it for several difficult days afterward, turning it over again and again. I want to be completely honest with you here. My motives, examined closely, were not entirely pure, however much I might have preferred them to be. There was a part of me, a small, wounded, deeply human part, that wanted exactly what Arjun had so accurately named, the vindication. The moment where my father would finally, inescapably have to look at the man he'd spent over a decade mocking and openly admit he had been wrong about him. I am not going to pretend to you now that this desire wasn't genuinely present in me. But underneath it, when I dug down further, deeper than my own wounded pride, was something more important, something that mattered more in the end. I did not want my parents, whatever their considerable failings, to actually lose their home. I did not want my father, at 62 years old, to watch everything he had spent his entire working life constructing simply collapse around him. Whatever pain they had caused Arjun and me across those 11 years, I discovered I did not want to become the kind of person who let that accumulated pain calcify into deliberate cruelty of my own making. There was another layer to this decision that I haven't mentioned yet, one involving my younger brother, Rohan. Rohan had, by this point, moved abroad for work several years earlier and had, in many ways, quietly distanced himself from the whole tangled situation at home, not out of malice, but simply because distance had made it easier for him to avoid the family's expectations and dramas in a way I, living only 20 minutes from my parents' house, never had the luxury of doing. When I called him, hesitantly, to tell him what was happening with our parents' finances, his response surprised me. "Honestly, Mira," he said over a crackling international line, "I always thought Arjun was a good guy. I never understood why Ma and Papa treated him the way they did. If you two can help them, you should. Not because they deserve it necessarily, but because you'll regret it more if you don't, and have to live with that regret for the rest of your life. I know you well enough to know that." Rohan's perspective mattered to me more than I expected it to. It reminded me that my own view of the family, shaped as it was by years of daily proximity and accumulated small wounds, wasn't necessarily the only valid perspective available, and that stepping back occasionally could offer clarity I couldn't always access on my own. The real betrayal, though, the moment that very nearly broke everything between us, the moment I still find difficult to revisit even now, didn't come from the underlying debt situation itself. It came from what happened once my parents discovered that we already knew. My mother called me one particular evening, and this time there was no pretense of casualness left in her voice at all. She had spoken with someone I never fully established who, perhaps a contact at the bank, perhaps some mutual acquaintance who had pieced things together, and had learned, in fairly specific detail, that Arjun's company had grown considerably larger than we had ever let on to the family. She knew, somehow, about the software product he'd built. She knew about the growing client roster, which by that point included several genuinely large, well-known companies. She knew, in short and in essence, that the computer boy she had spent 11 years quietly, persistently humiliating was, by any reasonable and objective measure, now considerably wealthier and more professionally successful than my own father had ever been, even at the height of his construction business. I expected shock from her when the call came. I expected, perhaps naively, given everything I already knew about my mother, some kind of dawning apology, some genuine reckoning with over a decade of comments delivered across countless dinner tables. What I received instead was something considerably worse than anything I had braced myself for. "Why didn't you tell us?" she demanded, her voice sharper than I had heard it in years, cutting through the phone line with real force. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is for us? Your father's business friends, our own relatives, if this ever gets out, that we've been quietly struggling financially this whole time while you two have been sitting on all this money without saying a word. Mira, how could you let us find out this way? From strangers, practically?" I sat there, phone pressed hard against my ear, and felt something inside me go very still and very cold, all at once. Not because she was angry, exactly, I understood, in some distorted way that only years of familiarity could produce, that fear and wounded pride can curdle quickly into anger in people who have never learned any healthier way to name their own fear directly. What actually broke something loose in me, something that had perhaps been straining for years without my full awareness, was what she said immediately afterward. "You should have told us Arjun was doing so well for himself. We could have approached this whole situation so differently. Asked you both for help properly, as family should. Instead, now we're going to have to go begging, and everyone in the family will eventually know that you two let us suffer through all this while you sat comfortably on your success. Let us suffer." As though the 11 accumulated years of quiet humiliation Arjun had absorbed at that very dinner table, in that very house, in front of those very relatives, had simply never happened at all, had evaporated entirely from memory the exact moment they suddenly needed something substantial from us. As though the computer boy jokes, and the switched teacups on that very first evening, and the pointed comparisons to Divya's husband, and the comment about how some men provide, others just try their best had all been nothing, had cost nothing, had left no lasting mark on anyone. "You spent 11 years telling me I had settled," I said, my voice shaking audibly now, no longer able to keep it steady. "You spent 11 years mocking him, openly, at practically every single family dinner we ever attended together. And now, after all of that, you're upset with us because we didn't rush immediately to tell you exactly how much money he was making?" There was a long, heavy silence on the line after I said this. Then my mother said something I know I will never fully forget, something that, more than any single comment delivered across any single dinner table over those 11 years, finally revealed with total clarity exactly how she had always genuinely seen the two of us, beneath all the surface politeness. "That's different, Mira," she said, her voice flat and certain. "Family teases each other sometimes. That's simply normal, that's how families are. But hiding something this significant from us, deliberately keeping us in the dark about it, that's a real betrayal." I hung up the phone and sat alone in our darkened kitchen for a long time afterward, unmoving, turning her words over and over in my mind, searching for some angle that would make them sting less. I couldn't find one. Arjun found me sitting there roughly an hour later, having just come home from a late client meeting, and he didn't need to ask what had happened, he could read it clearly on my face the moment he walked through the door. I told him everything my mother had said, word for word as best I could recall it. I watched something shift and settle in his own expression as he listened, not anger exactly, but a kind of deep, tired sadness, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent well over a decade quietly absorbing casual cruelty and had genuinely hoped, somewhere in some private corner of himself he rarely let show, that this specific moment, the moment of exposure, of the truth finally becoming undeniable, might soften something fundamental between our two families. Instead, it had only revealed exactly how deep and how old the underlying wound truly went. "I don't know what to do," I told him honestly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Part of me wants to walk away from this entirely. Let the house go. Let them face the direct consequences of what they've built and mismanaged. And another part of me can't bear the thought of it happening, can't bear watching them lose everything." Arjun sat down slowly across from me at our small kitchen table, and he took a long moment, longer than usual, before he spoke again. "Can I tell you honestly what I think, right now, without either of us deciding anything yet?" he asked. I nodded, unable to trust my own voice. "I think," he continued carefully, "that you've spent your entire life trying to earn something from your parents that they were quite possibly never going to give you freely, not because you were somehow unworthy of receiving it, but because they simply don't know how to give that kind of unconditional love or respect. Not to you, and honestly, maybe not to anyone in their lives, not even to each other in certain ways. Approval, for people built the way your father is built, isn't something offered as a gift. It's a transaction, always, whether they realize that about themselves or not. And I think, if we do end up saving this house now, we should do it quietly, without ever demanding anything in return for it. Not to close some kind of ledger, but to finally, at long last, Close this particular chapter on our own terms, Mira, not theirs. What would that actually mean, practically speaking? It means, he said slowly, we don't beg them to apologize for the past 11 years. We don't sit around waiting for them to fully admit, out loud, in so many words, that they were wrong about me, about us. We simply act, quietly and deliberately, from a place of genuine strength rather than resentment, and we let our actions speak in a way that words never quite managed to across all those dinner tables. I want to tell you that I felt only clarity and steady peace after that particular conversation, but that would not be entirely truthful, and I promised you honesty above all else in telling this story properly. For weeks afterward, I moved through my days in something like a fog, caught between conflicting emotions that refused to resolve themselves neatly, grief for the relationship with my parents I had always quietly wanted and had somehow never fully managed to have, anger at the casual, repeated cruelty they had shown my husband across more than a decade, genuine fear about what might happen to them if we chose to do nothing at all, and underneath every other feeling, a slow, steadily hardening resolve that had, I came to realize, actually been building quietly within me for years already, without my fully recognizing its presence or its weight until this crisis forced me to confront it directly. There was one more significant conversation before everything finally began to shift, the last ordinary family dinner at my parents' house before their financial situation became more widely known within the extended family, before the whispers started circulating at gatherings, before my father's face began to carry a new and unfamiliar kind of tiredness I had genuinely never observed on him before, not even during the most difficult stretches of his career. It was, without either Arjun or myself planning it that way in advance, the very final dinner where my father made one of his old, familiar comments about Arjun in that same tired, dismissive tone he'd used for over a decade. We were sitting at the same dining table where I had sat as a small child, where I had first brought Arjun to meet my parents all those years earlier, where the good teacups had quietly become the ordinary ones within the first hour of that visit. My father, perhaps attempting, consciously or not, to reclaim some fading sense of authority within a life that was visibly slipping further out of his direct control with each passing week, looked across the table at Arjun and said, with a distinctly thin attempt at his old familiar humor, still fixing computers, Arjun? Or have you finally managed to find something a bit more substantial to occupy your time? The table went noticeably quiet. I felt my entire body tense in anticipation, bracing myself for the familiar wave of shame, the familiar reflexive urge to quickly change the subject, to protect everyone present from an uncomfortable, lingering silence. But Arjun simply smiled, a real, genuine smile, calm and entirely unbothered in a way I honestly hadn't witnessed from him at that particular table in years, and said only, "I'm doing quite well, uncle. Thank you for asking." That was all he said. He didn't reveal his company's current valuation. He didn't mention the growing client list, or the custom software product, or the 11 employees now on payroll, or the sustained growth that had, by that point, made his business genuinely worth more than my father's construction company had ever been valued at, even at its historical peak. He simply let the moment sit there in the air, entirely unadorned, unembellished, and something about his quiet, settled calm made the old joke land flat in a way it never once had before across all those previous years. My father's practiced smile faltered slightly at the edges. My mother reached quickly for her water glass, deliberately avoiding eye contact with anyone at the table. I remember thinking, watching that small, quiet exchange unfold, this is the very last time this house will ever manage to make him feel small. I didn't yet know how literally, how completely true that private thought would eventually become. Within roughly 4 months, my father's company would default on its restructured loan terms entirely. The bank would begin moving formally toward foreclosure proceedings against the property used as collateral, including, in significant part, the family house itself, tied inextricably into the broader business assets, and my parents, the very people who had spent 11 consecutive years telling me, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that I had settled for far less than I deserved, would find themselves sitting across from us for the very first time in our entire marriage, not to mock, but to genuinely, desperately ask for help. What happened at that difficult meeting, and what I ultimately chose to do in the months that followed it, is a part of this story I still find genuinely difficult to put fully into words, even now, with considerable distance in time behind me, because it was the exact moment I finally came to understand, in a way I never had before, the crucial difference between revenge and true justice, and just how easily one can be mistaken for the other if you aren't deliberately, carefully careful about which one you ultimately choose to become in the moment that matters most. The meeting itself happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening, in our home this time, not theirs. I want to note that particular detail carefully, because it mattered to me far more than I initially expected it would. For the very first time in 11 years of marriage, my parents sat within a space that belonged entirely to Arjun and me, on furniture we had chosen together, within a house we had actually managed to purchase outright 2 full years earlier without ever once telling them, because Arjun had insisted, gently but with unusual firmness, that certain victories deserved to remain private until we were genuinely ready to share them entirely on our own terms and in our own time. My father looked noticeably older than I remembered him looking even a few months earlier. Not in terms of actual months past, but in the way that sustained, compounding stress can compress years of visible aging into a single difficult season. My mother's hands were folded tightly together in her lap throughout the entire meeting, and for the first time in my living memory, I saw her looking directly at Arjun with an expression that carried something other than casual dismissal. It looked, unmistakably and rather painfully, like genuine fear, fear of what we might ultimately choose to say, fear of what we might, quite reasonably, choose to withhold from them after everything that had passed between our families. My father spoke first, and I could hear clearly, in the careful, halting way he constructed each sentence, exactly how much the words were costing him to say aloud. I know, he began slowly, visibly searching for the right words, that we haven't always, that I personally haven't always shown Arjun the kind of respect he genuinely deserved from us. He paused for a long moment, and I watched him search for the remainder of the sentence, a proud man clearly unused to the act of apologizing, arriving somewhere he had evidently never planned or expected to arrive. But I'm asking you both now, I'm asking you directly for help. The house, the business, everything we've built, if we lose all of it now, at my age, I honestly don't know how we would even begin to rebuild from nothing. I felt Arjun's hand find mine steadily beneath the table, offering a small, grounding pressure. I had genuinely expected, in the days leading up to this particular meeting, that I would feel some measure of triumph in this exact moment. I had imagined it more than once in private, if I'm being fully honest with you now, the scene playing out where my father finally, unavoidably had to ask us directly, finally had to acknowledge, however reluctantly, what he had steadfastly refused to see clearly for well over a decade. But sitting there in that room, watching him struggle visibly through those difficult words, I discovered I didn't feel triumph at all. I felt something quieter and considerably more complicated instead, a kind of deep, aching grief for all the accumulated years it had taken us to arrive at this particular point, and alongside that grief, a fierce, unexpected protectiveness, not only for Arjun, which made complete sense to me, but strangely, unexpectedly, for my own father too, watching him appear so genuinely small in a way I had truly never witnessed before in my entire life. Arjun spoke calmly when it was his turn, in the same steady, measured way he had always spoken, the same quality that had carried him through 11 years of accumulated quiet humiliation at that family's collective hands without ever once raising his voice or losing his composure at any dinner table. "We'll help you," he said simply. "But I want to be completely honest with you both about exactly how, and I want you to genuinely hear this clearly, because I believe it matters considerably more than the money itself ever could." He then explained, calmly and methodically, the plan we had carefully discussed together over the preceding weeks. We would not simply hand over a check to cover the outstanding debt in full. That approach, we had both agreed after much discussion, would only serve to patch over the immediate crisis without genuinely addressing the underlying structural problems, and it would leave my father exactly where he had started from, still vulnerable to the same pattern of overextension that had caused this entire collapse in the first place. Instead, Arjun's company, working through a proper restructuring arrangement, carefully worked out with qualified lawyers and accountants on both sides, nothing improvised or driven purely by raw emotion, would formally purchase the distressed commercial property that had originally triggered the loan default, absorbing the resulting financial loss at fair market value, thereby freeing my father's company entirely from the collateral obligation that had been tied directly to the family home. And the house itself, the very house where I had grown up, where every single family dinner had carried its own small accumulated cruelties, where the good teacups had been quietly switched out for ordinary ones on that very first evening Arjun had ever visited, Arjun proposed, calmly and without any trace of theater, that we purchase it outright at fair market value, and then formally lease it back to my parents for a purely nominal, symbolic rent, for as long as they wished to continue living there. Not as some grand act of charity dangled conditionally over their heads for years to come. As a clean, straightforward transaction, transparent and clearly documented, that would remove the immediate crisis entirely and leave them with genuine, lasting security going forward. Why? My mother asked quietly, and I could hear real disbelief tangled together with something that sounded distinctly like shame threading through her voice as she spoke. After everything that's happened between us, why would you possibly do this for us now? Arjun considered the question carefully for a long moment before answering it, and when he finally did respond, his voice remained steady throughout, entirely without bitterness, entirely without any note of triumph, just simple, unadorned honesty. Because I never once needed your respect or approval to know exactly what I was worth, he said. I built everything I've built for Mira's sake, and for my own sake, not to prove any particular point to this family or to that dinner table. But I'm not willing to let pride, yours, or for that matter my own, cost you the roof over your heads. That's simply not the kind of man I want to become. And it's not the kind of husband I want Mira to have spent her life married to. I watched my father's face carefully in that particular moment, and something in it finally, visibly broke open, not dramatically, not with obvious tears exactly, but with a kind of quiet, internal collapse of the defenses he had spent his entire adult life carefully constructing and maintaining. I was wrong about you, he said, so quietly that I nearly missed the words entirely. I was wrong about you for a very long time, Arjun. Longer than I think I can properly account for. It would be satisfying, in the way these stories often are, to tell you that this single moment healed everything completely, that 11 accumulated years of small, persistent wounds simply closed themselves over the course of one evening's vulnerability. But real life, I have learned, rarely operates that cleanly or that quickly, and I promised you honesty throughout in telling this particular story. The truth is that genuinely healing what had happened over those 11 years took considerably longer than a single conversation, however significant that conversation turned out to be. My father, in the months that followed, tried in his own imperfect, halting way, asking Arjun real, substantive questions about his business and how it actually operated, genuinely listening to the answers instead of simply waiting for his turn to speak, showing up unannounced at a small company celebration Arjun's team held to mark a significant new contract, standing somewhat awkwardly near the refreshments table but genuinely present in a way he had truly never once been before across our entire marriage. My mother took considerably longer to shift. Pride, I have come to understand, dissolves far more slowly in people who have spent their entire lives building their sense of self around outward appearances and social comparison. But even she, gradually, over the course of that following year, stopped drawing comparisons between us and Divya's family, stopped making the small, pointed comments that used to arrive so reliably disguised as innocent concern. We completed the formal purchase of the house roughly 8 months after that difficult evening meeting. I remember standing in the living room where I had grown up, now legally and entirely ours, watching my mother walk slowly through rooms she had lived in for over 30 years, seeing them somehow differently now, understanding for what felt like the very first time in her life what it actually meant to be given something freely rather than to have earned the ongoing right to keep it through decades of careful appearances and unbending pride. She didn't say very much to me that particular day. But she reached for my hand at one point, something she genuinely hadn't done since I was quite young, and held it firmly for a long, quiet moment. I won't pretend to you that this story concludes with some grand, cinematic confrontation, some singular moment where I stood up dramatically and delivered the perfect speech that finally made my parents fully understand every year of accumulated hurt they had caused. That is simply not what actually happened, and I have come to genuinely believe that those kinds of dramatic, complete reckonings mostly exist within stories rather than in real families, where love and disappointment and stubborn pride tangle together in ways far too complicated for any single perfect sentence to fully untangle, however satisfying that sentence might feel to imagine delivering. What actually happened, in the end, was considerably quieter than that, and I believe, ultimately, far more meaningful for having unfolded the way it did. We did not destroy my parents simply to prove a point we had every right to prove. We did not stand by and let them fall purely because some part of us felt they had earned that particular consequence, though I will admit that a part of me, the deeply wounded part, the part shaped by 11 years of settling, might once, in an earlier version of myself, have genuinely wanted exactly that outcome. Instead, we became the kind of people capable of holding two difficult truths simultaneously, that they had hurt us, deeply and repeatedly, across more than a decade, and that they still deserved basic compassion, especially during their single most vulnerable moment. That is not weakness, I have come to understand. I used to believe that forgiveness meant pretending the original wounds had never actually happened. I understand now, with considerable hard-won clarity, that real forgiveness actually means choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, not to become the very thing that wounded you in the first place, even after you finally hold the power to do exactly that if you wanted to. Arjun's company continued growing steadily in the years that followed. 2 years after that pivotal meeting, he opened his second office in another city entirely, a milestone that would have seemed genuinely unimaginable to either of us during those early years above the tailor's shop. My father, of all people, gradually became one of his most vocal, enthusiastic supporters at subsequent family gatherings, a strange, almost quietly funny reversal that still makes me smile even now, watching him tell distant relatives at weddings about my son-in-law's growing company with a visible pride that would have been genuinely unthinkable just a few years earlier. I don't know, honestly, whether he remembers every single comment he made across all those old dinner tables over the years. I remember every one of them myself, with painful clarity. I will probably always remember them, in some quiet corner of my mind. But I have learned, gradually, that carrying the memory of something doesn't necessarily mean carrying the accompanying anger forever, indefinitely, without end. You can remember with complete accuracy exactly what someone did to you, and still choose, quite deliberately and with real effort, who you ultimately want to become in your ongoing response to that memory. If there is a single lesson embedded within this story, and I have turned this question over often, in quiet moments alone, examining it from different angles, I believe it is this: the people who mock what you're quietly building rarely, if ever, understand the full scope of what they're actually watching unfold in front of them. They see only a young man fixing computers in a small rented room and assume, confidently, that this represents the entire story, the whole of what he is and what he might become. They don't see the countless late nights spent working, the quiet, patient ambition sustained over years without any external validation, the invisible accumulated effort that eventually, given enough time and persistence, becomes something genuinely undeniable to everyone, including those who doubted it most. Real success, I have come to believe, doesn't actually require an audience while it's still happening. Sometimes the single most powerful thing you can do is simply allow people to underestimate you completely, and keep building anyway, steadily and quietly, until the day the truth finally arrives entirely on its own terms, precisely the way Arjun always promised me it eventually would. And when that day finally comes for you, when the very people who once doubted you most now genuinely need what you've spent years quietly building, I believe the true measure of who you've actually become isn't simply whether you choose to help them in their moment of need. It's how you choose to help them, and why. Not to humiliate them in return for old humiliations received. Not to collect methodically on years of accumulated debts of wounded pride. But because somewhere beneath 11 long years of small, accumulated cruelties, you never actually stopped being the kind of person capable of choosing grace, deliberately and consciously, in the exact moment you finally hold the power not to. That house still stands today, exactly where it always has. My parents still live within it, comfortably and securely. And every single time I visit now, I find myself sitting at that same familiar dining table, the very one where the good teacups were quietly switched out for ordinary ones, 11 long years ago, on a night that shaped so much of what followed, and I feel, finally, after everything, something I had genuinely spent well over a decade quietly waiting for, without ever fully knowing its proper name until it actually arrived.